Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about slavery, which is not funny. Yeah, so we put a lay on the eagle to try to cheer you up, but let's face it, this is going to be depressing. With slavery, every time you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, it turns out to have been much worse. Mr. Green, but what about... Yeah, me from the past. I'm going to stop you right there because you're going to embarrass yourself. Slavery was hugely important to America. I mean, it led to a civil war, and it also lasted what, at least in U.S. history, counts as a long-ass time, from 1619 to 1865. And yes, I know there's a 1,200-year-old church in your neighborhood in Denmark, but we're not talking about Denmark. But slavery is most important because we still struggle with its legacy. So yes, today's episode will probably not be funny, but it will be important. So the slave-based economy in the South is sometimes characterized as having been separate from the market revolution, but that's not really the case. Without Southern cotton, the North wouldn't have been able to industrialize, at least not as quickly, because cotton textiles were one of the first industrially produced products and the most important commodity in world trade by the 19th century. And 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. And speaking of cotton, why has no one mentioned to me that my collar has been half popped this entire episode like I'm trying to recreate the Flying Nun's hat? And although there were increasingly fewer slaves in the North as northern states outlawed slavery, cotton shipments overseas made northern merchants rich, northern bankers financed the purchase of land for plantations, northern insurance companies insured slaves who were, after all, considered property and very valuable property. And in addition to turning cotton into cloth for sale overseas, northern manufacturers sold cloth back to the South where it was used to clothe the very slaves who had cultivated it. But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially King cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities, like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all Southern urbanization took place in the Upper South, further away from the large cotton plantations. And slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors, like there was very little industry in the South. It produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods, and as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like, for instance, railroads. This lack of industry and railroads would eventually make the South suck at the Civil War, thankfully. In short, slavery dominated the South, shaping it both economically and culturally. And slavery wasn't a minor aspect of American society. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. Although in the popular imagination, most plantations were these sprawling affairs with hundreds of slaves, in reality, the majority of slaveholders owned 5 or fewer slaves. And of course, most white people in the South owned no slaves at all, although if they could afford to, they would sometimes rent slaves to help with their work. These were the so-called yeoman farmers who lived self-sufficiently, raised their own food, and purchased very little in the market economy. They worked the poorest land, and as a result, were mostly pretty poor themselves. But even they largely supported slavery, partly perhaps for aspirational reasons, and partly because the racism inherent to the system gave even the poorest whites legal and social status. And Southern intellectuals worked hard to encourage these ideas of white solidarity and to make the case for slavery. Many of the founders, a bunch of whom you'll remember held slaves, saw slavery as a necessary evil. Jefferson once wrote, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." The belief that justice and self-preservation couldn't sit on the same side of the scale was really opposed to the American idea, and in the end, it would make the Civil War inevitable. But as slavery became more entrenched and as ideas of liberty and political equality were embraced by more people, some Southerners began to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. They argued, for instance, that slaves benefited from slavery. Because, you know, their masters fed them and clothed them and took care of them in their old age. You still hear this argument today, astonishingly. In fact, you'll probably see asshats in the comments saying that. I will remind you, it's not cursing if you are referring to an actual ass. This paternalism allowed masters to see themselves as benevolent and to contrast their family-oriented slavery with the cold, mercenary capitalism of the free labor North. So yeah, in the face of rising criticism of slavery, some Southerners began to argue that the institution was actually good for the social order. One of the best-known proponents of this view was John C. Calhoun, who in 1837 said this in a speech on the Senate floor: "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. Now, of course, John C. Calhoun was a fringe politician and nobody took his views particularly seriously.
Well, he was Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845.
Well, I mean, who really cares about the Secretary of State, Stan?
He was also Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825.
All right, but we don't even have a Secretary of War anymore.
And he was Vice President from 1825 to 1832.
Oh my God, were we insane? We were, of course, but we justified the insanity with biblical passages and with the examples of the Greeks and Romans and with outright racism, arguing that black people were inherently inferior to whites and that not to keep them in slavery would upset the natural order of things, a worldview popularized millennia ago by my nemesis, Aristotle. God, I hate Aristotle. You know what defenders of Aristotle always say? He was the first person to identify dolphins. Well, okay. Dolphin identifier. Yes, that is what he should be remembered for, but he's a terrible philosopher. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might have. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm gonna whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm gonna whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every lick if they hit you hard. That brutality, the whippings, the brandings, the rape, was real, and it was intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. This enabled slaveholders to rationalize what they were doing, and it was hoped to reduce slaves to the animal property that is implied by the term chattel slavery. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery. But African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged to by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students, nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 60s, with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington of August 1963.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Capturing the attention of the media and the population, this event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. One day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
Following that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended the prejudiced voting system. Instantly effective, blacks began voting and running for public office. However, just days later, on August 11th, a violent six-day riot in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts resulted in 34 deaths. This was indicative of a period of racially motivated violence that occurred in the mid to late 1960s. This era also saw the rise of Black Power, led in large part by Stokely Carmichael, in opposition to extremists like the Ku Klux Klan. This ideology was exemplified by the Black Panther Party, which followed the principles set forth by Malcolm X. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, his radical ideas advocated militancy for blacks.
Black people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied not only with the white man, but they're dissatisfied with these Negroes who have been sitting around here posing as leaders and spokesmen for black people and actually making the problem worse instead of making the problem better.
He remained an influential and controversial human rights activist until his assassination in 1965. The murders of civil rights leaders continued when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in April 1968 and Robert Kennedy 2 months later. Despite racial tensions continuing into the 1990s, progress has been measurable. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 is seen by many to be a culmination of centuries of work in favor of racial equality.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall, and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we've tried to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. Yeah, but you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call dismissals. Yeah. Let us hang the wash out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, 'cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. But we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Oh, yeah. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Tell them those pilgrim women who braved the boat. They could cook the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who showed the flag, was left behind that first election day. What a shame, sisters! Then Susan B. Anthony, yeah, and Julia Howe, Lucretia Mott, and others. They showed us how they carried signs and marched in lines until at long last the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Oh. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Oh, yeah. And now we cool down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Yeah. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Yeah, all right, we got it now. Since 1920, sisters unite.
By the 1960s, more Western women were coming out of higher education than ever before, with new ambitions for themselves. And as prosperity grew and new appliances went into more homes, some of the old drudgery was removed.
These labor-saving, time-saving devices in our homes free a woman so she...
As this happened, many American women grew dissatisfied and frustrated. They found their manifesto in a book that became a bestseller in 1963. In The Feminine Mystique, New York academic Betty Friedan wrote a devastating critique of the modern woman's situation. Women, as well as men, can only find their identity in work that uses their full capacities. A woman cannot find her identity in the dull routine of housework, she wrote. If a job is to be the way out of the trap for a woman, it must be a job that she can take seriously as part of a life plan, work in which she can grow as part of society.
The majority of American women in many age groups are working outside the home, but most of them are working at low-paid, relatively low-skilled jobs often in a dead end from professional advancement, and they are not really taking part in the decision-making areas of American life in anything except token numbers.
For some, like Colleen Perot, who'd got married after the war, Friedan's ideas were anathema.
I thought, how strange. What is wrong with this woman? Everybody I knew was not oppressed and was very happy and was not miserable, and we were all enjoying raising our families.
But for other housewives like Jackie Ceballos, the feminine mystique was a revelation.
Betty Friedan was speaking to me. I was a married woman trapped. It just expanded my life. The first thing I thought of was, instead of blaming my husband or myself, I realized it wasn't us, it was the society.
In 1963, American society was changing fast. The campaign for civil rights for black Americans was making real progress. Women's grievances became another cause. They called for an end to discrimination on grounds of gender, too. The Great March in Washington that year led to a landmark victory for all minorities, and also for women. President Johnson's Civil Rights Act of 1964 guaranteed equal rights for everyone. With the passing of the act, women started to apply for jobs they'd previously been barred from. Telephone operator Lorena Weeks saw her chance.
I was very excited. I knew this would mean that women could have better paying jobs. I bid on the job for Switchman, and my bid was returned, stating that this was not a job being awarded to women.
Citing the Civil Rights Act, Weeks took her fight to be a telephone engineer to court. But she lost when the company found an obscure law that barred women from lifting more than 30 pounds.
It was just foolish to use something like that against women. Women every day lift babies that weigh more than 30 pounds.
Is Miss America. We are going to sing your song. Oh, there she is, Miss America. There she is.
Inside, one set of young women accepted the chauvinist baubles. Outside, others carried on with more consciousness raising. Jackie Ceballos was there again.
Women use your brains, not your bodies.
We threw bras and girdles and stockings, high-heeled shoes, and cosmetics into the trash can. The press loved it, and we learned very early on that the press liked crazy things, so let's use the press. We didn't burn any bras. They would have happened if they had allowed us to have a fire.
The stunts got the coverage they wanted, but at some risk to their reputation.
For those who think that the women's liberation movement is a joke vaguely connected with burning bras and getting in the men-only bars, may I disabuse you of that notion. It is about equal pay and equal opportunity in the job market.
In the 1960s, a new generation of Mexican Americans created a militant social movement in response to the anger and frustration that had been building for so many years within their community. In California and Texas, they demanded humane treatment in the fields where they labored. In New Mexico, they fought to reclaim land once owned by their ancestors. It became clear that without political power, Mexican Americans would remain second-class citizens.
And we're poor, man. I mean, we're poor. And nobody wants to do nothing about it. You still kissing the Democratic Party, thinking they're going to save you, and they ain't going to do it.
In a small South Texas town, a new political party took shape that threatened to change the political landscape of America.
These are Chicano people here. You've never met us. We're not in the dictionary. It's a brand new ballgame. You're going to have to relearn all your stereotypes and all your myths because we are about to begin creating new ones, tough ones, and great ones. And I suggest you learn fast if you want to match us.
As the nation watched, Chicanos took on the most challenging quest of the Mexican-American civil rights movement. In 20 years, there would be almost 5,000 Latino elected officials in the United States. Half would come from Texas. The victories of the Chicano movement became the lasting legacy of decades of Mexican-American activism. The United Farm Workers made Americans aware of the plight of workers who brought food to their table and inspired labor activists in the cities.
I think that the farm workers movement was one of those life-changing instruments that helped teach so many of us the power that lies within each one of ourselves.
The walkouts challenged educators to respond to community needs and served as a catalyst for bilingual instruction in grade schools and the creation of Chicano studies programs at colleges and universities.
Students said, ya basta. We can think, we can learn, we can speak more than one language. We can read, we can write, we can go on to college, we can be professionals. We can contribute not only to this society, but to our communities in ways that teachers have told us we can't do in the past.
A generation of Mexican-American artists, writers, poets, and musicians reclaimed their heritage and gave new definition to American culture.
I think that Chicano art had a very, very important role within the Chicano movement because it not only said what was going on, but it also questioned things. And that's what made it as rich as it is now.
We were young, demanding our civil rights, demanding our place in society, demanding access to education, demanding all of the things that we were entitled to as citizens of the United States, as human beings.
Chicanos, with a passion for social justice, helped bring about changes that expanded and inspired the meaning of civil rights in America.
It was one of the greatest demonstrations of freedom in the history of the United States. 50 years ago, standing at this very spot in front of a memorial of a man who signed the first ever Emancipation Proclamation, Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights leaders drew over 200,000 people to the nation's capital to demand equality for all. In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. told his followers that he was here to cash in a check for the black community that promised justice and equality and freedom above all. Now, he says that that check was written into the words of the Declaration of Independence as well as the Constitution. This week, to mark the anniversary of that great speech, thousands once again descended on D.C. to remember the legacy of the March on Washington. And there, on the Lincoln Memorial steps, 5 decades to the day after Dr. King spoke those famous words, America's first black president told the crowd there was still more work to be done.
We now have a choice. We can continue down our current path in which the gears of this great democracy grind to a halt and our children accept a life of lower expectations, where politics is a zero-sum game, where few do very well while struggling families of every race fight over a shrinking economic pie. That's one path. Or we can have the courage to change.
So let's take a look at some of the major issues African Americans faced in 1963 and see where they stand today. As a result of his I Have a Dream speech and his leadership throughout the entire civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. has had streets named after him. He's had schools and post offices named after him. He's had libraries across the country named after him. And he is the first African American to ever have a memorial on the National Mall to commemorate him. But where does the U.S. stand today in terms of equal rights?
What I see in the Capitol, or in the government now, is a lot of stalemate because of, truthfully, I'm just going to tell it, I believe because of President Obama. You know, and I think there's a racial aspect that's put into this.
A new interactive map created by University of Virginia research associate Dustin Cable brings us a visual manifestation of lingering racial divides in the U.S. Blue dots represent white people, green dots represent black people, and so on. The divide is especially clear in cities like Chicago, where streets and neighborhoods are split up into one color or the other. So what about income inequality and poverty?
The number one issue is our economic disparities and the fact that we are now challenged in many states on our voting rights.
Today, 28% of African Americans live below the poverty line, compared to 10% of whites. Unemployment for black Americans is double that of white Americans, standing at 12.6%, something modern civil rights leaders say must be addressed.
There are a few who've done very well, but there are 50 million Americans in poverty. First-class schools, jails, and second-class schools. 2.5 million Americans are in prison. Over half are African Americans.
One of the most important rights Dr. King and other civil rights leaders fought for was the right to vote. Today, there are 44 black men and women serving in Congress, showing that the voting rights barrier was trampled. But with the U.S. Supreme Court's recent repeal of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, civil rights advocates are worried the U.S. could be moving backward.
I don't want to see us lose any of the gains that we've made because we still have a long ways to go. And if we're going to have people being a part of the process, we don't want to put up roadblocks.
Finally, perhaps the most famous aspect of Dr. King's dream, the dream that his children might one day have the same educational opportunities as everyone else. The dream of attending school with white children has been realized. However, graduation rates among black students still fall significantly behind white students. And for those who don't graduate high school, they are more likely to go to jail than to find a job. In the end, the one recurring theme throughout the rally was that Dr. King's speech from 50 years ago was an important landmark in American history. But more needs to be done to keep the wheels of progress turning. In Washington, on the steps where Dr. King spoke those famous words, Megan Lopez, RT.